Death and destruction of biblical proportions is now underway due to catastrophic climate change. The U.S. spends almost $1 trillion a year annually renewable on bullets, bombs, and ballistic missiles, while 38 million of its people face hunger every day. 800 military bases worldwide protecting nothing and poisoning the earth. Our current president supported and promoted the Iraq War under a false pretense. It killed 1 million innocent civilians. And the guy before him, the 45th president, doesn't read or write. And he's running again. 1/3, over 300,000 Americans died during a pandemic because they didn't have universal health care. Cancer patients are 250% more likely to go bankrupt and then are much more likely to die of their cancer. 30 million Americans don't have health care right now. 60% of Americans can't cover a $500 emergency. These are the stories that need told now. Release the truth tellers, border to border and coast to coast. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Well, hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on into another Podcast by George. I mean, that's a dramatic intro, but I'm telling you, folks, these are dramatic times that we're living in, and we're going to cover all of that. We're going to talk about the big three today, big time, with an old buddy, an old pal that's coming on the Podcast by George live line. Once again, he's a favorite of my followers and viewers. And folks, it's Matthew Ho. And of course, he just wrapped up his campaign in North Carolina for the U.S. Senate seat on the Green Party ticket. And people may be aware he kind of jumped to the forefront of the American media scene in 2009 when he resigned from the U.S. State Department over the American escalation of the war in Iraq. I mean, I just love this guy. He's a peace activist. He's an Assange supporter. He and I just agree on everything. And if I ever found anything that I didn't agree with him on, I think I would reconsider what I'm thinking about. So let me take that off. Let me put that up on screen and let me take that down, bring this over. The beginning of this thing's always a little dicey, and I'll click this button. That'll do it. And then this will bring him up. There he is. So good morning, Matthew Ho.
Hey, George, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, pal. And I, by way of explanation, I hasn't been on for a while, but he was real busy out there in North Carolina. And I didn't want to intrude as the campaign was coming into its final cycle here. And this thing is over with, kinda. There's some loose ends that still need to be sewed up, and we're going to talk about that. I'm going to bring this on screen, Matt. You can jump in here and talk about this any point you want to. Now, this is NPR. And I take issue with NPR. I'm taking issue with everything in the mainstream media, the way that they report things anymore. But this is an accounting, their article, Republican Ted Budd takes North Carolina Senate seat, beating Democrat Sherry Beasley. And Matt, you and I talked about, how the Democrats were approaching this thing. And it seems like they were really vociferous, really active about beating you, but not so much this other guy in the Republican Party. It says, despite Democrats hoping abortion rights would motivate their voters, inflation, the economy, and crime were top of mind in the state. Okay, before I go any further, Matt, that kind of sounds like Matthew Ho's campaign. I mean, that's what you were talking about. I mean, those are your issues that you campaigned on every single day. And when you and I were talking about the candidacy, I was saying, why doesn't the Democratic Party reach out? Why don't they integrate your policies and programs, embrace you, bring your followers in? And I'm going to show some numbers here in a minute where that might have been really important, but they didn't. It looks to me like they were completely comfortable with maintaining the status quo and losing, and that's exactly what they did.
They and they lost the Democrats. And thanks for having me on again, George.
Yeah,
good to see you.
Yeah, pal.
The Democrats lost across the state. They lost the statewide judicial races. The Republicans now have a supermajority in the state Senate. So, and they are one seat away from having a supermajority in the state House, which would allow them, a veto-proof majority over the governor. And as well as all throughout, the Democrats ran a flaccid, weak, uninspiring campaign. The only race that was competitive, we have 14 congressional districts here in North Carolina, and there was really only one race that was going to be deemed competitive. There was another one that ended up being a bit competitive because, again, the Democrats ran an uninspiring moderate who wasn't going to get people out to vote. That was in the 1st congressional district with Don Davis, where he defeated a really great progressive named Erica Smith, who runs on a host of issues that are necessary, particularly for the people of Eastern North Carolina, which is just economically disastrous out there. And they ran Don Davis instead, someone who had voted in the state house to defund Planned Parenthood. That's who they backed. He got a ton of money. He got a ton of support from the DCCC, which is the organization that supports Democratic House candidates, as well as a ton of money from AIPAC, the Israeli lobby. And we saw a lot of Israeli lobby money in the races throughout North Carolina, like we saw throughout the country, trying to beat progressive challengers. But, I was saying there's only one race that was competitive. It's 13th race, 13th congressional district, excuse me. And it was a moderate Democrat who had been in the state legislature for quite a while, running against a 25-year-old Trump-endorsed loudmouth. And I mean, the weekend before the election, this guy named Bo Hines, is asked, because he's very much against abortion, and I'm not joking about this. He's asked, what happens if a teenage girl is raped and is impregnated? And his answer is she should go in front of a panel and explain what happened, and then the panel will decide what she should do. I mean, like something like straight out of The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
Wiley, the Democrat in that race, barely beat him. Only beat him a couple percentage points. So they ran, the Democrats across the board ran a very weak, uninspiring race. I could see it in my state house races, which were sort of competitive to the point, at least, we were getting a couple flyers a day. And my state house representative, a guy named Terrence Everett, who's been a good progressive. I mean, times in the past, I've sent him notes saying, hey, thanks for standing up on this, And what you're getting from him is just the messages that you saw from the Democrats across the state, from Sherry Beasley at the top of the Senate race all the way down to the school board races, which were these vague statements about public safety, about family values, and about lowering costs, and not saying at all what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, what makes them different than Republicans. They are trying to distance themselves from Joe Biden, which I think, particularly as you saw gas prices improve, and the economy kind of shake out better with numbers. I mean, the economy is terrible, but at least what the media was saying, I think that was a mistake. But, they seem to have the same Democratic consultants, not just in North Carolina, but across the country, because I've heard this from other people throughout the nation about how the Democratic Party ran their races. There's a great article or a great interview by Ryan Grimm of The Intercept with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where she talks about exactly this, how this played out in New York. Again, these vague, uninspiring state races that seemed to make sure that they weren't going to disappoint or concern their big money donors, right? That they going to concern or upset or cause any fear among their corporate donors, as well as going after those mythical Republican crossover voters that they seem to year after year be chasing after.
Since Reagan, I mean, they've been trying to get those people back.
The left for granted. And, and again, I'm not just saying this. This is what I mean. I heard this, in particular for North Carolina, from members of the Democratic Party, including state officers within the Democratic Party, who said kind of what you said. If we put half the passion we put into this race against Bud and against the Republicans as we did into keeping you off the ballot, what difference would that have made? But they really didn't have much to run on. They were afraid to embrace anything that might actually do something, because again, they're going after these mythical Republican crossover voters. And more importantly, I believe they're so afraid of causing an issue with their corporate donors.
Well, the Democrats in history have proven, the Dixiecrats in particular, that they'll cross over on racial issues predominantly, but those Republicans aren't crossing over. They never have. They never will. They're never going to cross over for a Democrat. Let me bring this up on screen again because I wanted to go over this once more. This top paragraph that I said, despite Democrats hoping abortion rights would motivate their voters, inflation, the economy, and crime were top of mind in the state. And you say, gee, they made a mistake. The Democrat, you know who saw that? You know who knew that? Matthew Hoh knew that. I knew that. Matthew Hoh never run for political office before. He figured this out, and they were unable to. So I'm not giving these people a pass. These are momos, folks, political momos. We might talk about that a little bit. Are they too dumb, or are they in on it? It says Senate-elect Budd has downplayed get this, he downplays the January 6th insurrection and once called those who stormed the Capitol patriots. He also has refused to answer whether he believes President Biden won the 2020 election. This is the guy that defeated the Democrat in North Carolina. Okay, so I want to bring this up on screen so I can see this a little bit larger. Now, these are the numbers. And it looks like, Bud won, not by the slimmest of margins, but it was pretty slim. You look at these other candidates here in the votes, and the other candidates would include Matthew Hoh. Votes, 81,571. Well, if you add those back in on the Democratic side of the ledger, still not a winner. But here's the way that I look at that, Matt. If the Democrats again had embraced these winning policies that I just mentioned and that you just delineated, if they had embraced those programs and policies, and if they had embraced your candidacy, your followers, your people, and brought those in, people that didn't vote, that maybe even voted Republican, might have looked at that and said, hey, I can support this. I can get behind this. So that 81,571 figure that I'm showing on screen could have become twice, 3 times that. And then you've got a winner and you've got some great programs and policies to get behind. I mean, is that a stretch or is there anything to that?
No, I think there's something to that. I mean, the number of unaffiliated voters who showed up to vote, which are the unaffiliated voters, are the plurality here in North Carolina. They're the biggest they're the biggest block of registered voters are the unaffiliated or independent voters. Their turnout was very low compared to Democratic and Republican registered voters. And overall turnout was 50.5%, which is not bad for a midterm election, but also too, you look at it and you say barely half the people voted, but again, why are you going to go out and vote? Why? Yeah. I mean, what's going to get you to go to the polls? And they do a good job here in North Carolina. I mean, I'll give credit where credit's due. I mean, certainly things could be done better in a lot of ways with how we vote. But we know our absentee ballots go out in September, and then we have 2.5 weeks of early voting here. And then of course election day. So, to get people out, there's opportunities to vote. We're not like some states where you can only vote on election day or your early voting period is very limited. So the idea though, that what motivates people to turn out, and if you're not giving people a reason to turn out, if you're basically presenting the status quo, but I think there's a lot to that though. I think the Democrats and Republicans, and Republicans are invested in the status quo. They want their partisan, they're depending upon their partisan voters to turn out. And they're so afraid of alienating their corporate donors. And because the money is so important, and you're so afraid of alienating, particularly those who are throwing in that, that dark money, that unaccountable money, the Citizens United money. And of course, like in this race, like in so many other races, the amount of money spent by outside contributors, not aligned with, not supposedly connected to the campaigns, multiples more than what the campaign spent. So, that's so important to these races, to these candidates, to these parties, not to alienate their donors, that they don't want to reach out to unaffiliated donors, to maybe there are crossover voters. They don't want to reach out to unaffiliated voters, I should say, not donors, but, because the money is so important.
It's all about the money.
Yeah. And one thing I want to note too, that you can take away from this race with Ted Budd winning is it says in that article you read about Bud not commenting about January 6th or the presidential elections, who won the presidential elections.
Yeah.
Bud didn't comment on much.
Right.
In the primary, which the Republican primary for U.S. Senate, which was a pretty contested primary with, 3 other serious contenders, Bud didn't take part in any of the primaries. I mean, any of the debates. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Any of the debates, and he didn't give many interviews, and he didn't do a lot of public appearances, and that continued through the general election campaign. And where he was not giving interviews to reporters, he was not doing public appearances. Everything was a closed event. There was one debate between Sherry Beasley, the Democrat, and Ted Budd, the Republican. Myself and the Libertarian were excluded from that debate.
Yes.
But the way that debate was set up was it was set up on a Friday night at 8 p.m. on a cable channel that less than 1/3 of North Carolina residents receive. So the estimate was that only about 1% of North Carolina voters saw that debate. And that's how they wanted it. And Beasley, the Democratic candidate, wasn't much different than Bud. She did very few public events. She did very few interviews. She had the Democrats had cleared out the Democratic Senate primary here in North Carolina to anoint her. Basically, they cleared out any challengers, so she just walked through the primary, didn't have to do anything for that. So not only were both candidates uninspiring, just really trying to reach out to their partisan base, as well as making sure their donors felt secure. They were not interested in they were uninspiring, and they were not interested in doing media, and they were not doing anything that potentially could cause them a problem through a slip up, because they were not very good. But the danger in all that the point of all that is that it doesn't allow that public access to these people.
Right.
And if they're going to be like that when they're campaigning, when they're trying
guess
to
what?
votes,
Yeah.
what do you think they're going to be like when they're in office?
Yeah, that's right. All right. I don't want to spend all show on North Carolina, because we got a lot of things to talk
Sure.
about. I've got a couple of things, a couple of stories that nobody seems to want to talk about. Well, we're going to, and it has to do with Ukraine. The Pentagon's failed another audit. My God, hard to believe. We might get some Julian Assange in there, and I want to talk about Roger Waters a little bit too. So we got a lot of things to talk about, but I wanted to tie these loose ends up that I mentioned here. Now, this is out of your Twitter feed here. Our grassroots, largely volunteer-run campaign missed an early IRS deadline, and we now have to pay a $5,800 fine. It may sound outrageous, but we have to pay. And after working so hard on this campaign, I'd greatly appreciate your help one more time. Okay, I want to, encourage everybody to help pitch in every way that they can. I'm going to. But here's the thing, Matt. I look at that and I think, you're a dangerous man, Matthew Ho. I mean, these crazy ideas that you had about the economy and healthcare and helping people afford the rent and all of these things that you were talking about on the campaign trail, that's dangerous. And then, of course, unlike, I think, the Democrats who tried to block your campaign and were overruled, I don't know that cost them anything. I don't know if they were fined for that, but you're fined $5,800 by the IRS for missing some kind of an arbitrary deadline. To me, again, this just goes to show that the whole system, it appears to me, isn't too dumb. It's in on it.
Yeah, and we're not even sure why we had to pay to begin with, because we're supposedly exempt from that requirement. But this is there's so much to say about this. First, let me say, please don't donate. Thank you, George, for saying that, for putting this up. I saw this morning and I thought to myself, I got to tell them we're good on the money now. Okay. And then, of course, I didn't. So, but thank you. I appreciate it so much. But we are good on our money in terms of covering our obligations at this point. And hopefully we will have that $5,800 refunded to us. We've appealed it. We appealed it a while ago. But this is one of the things about running as an independent race, a third party race, grassroots, whatever you want to call it, is that to have the people who are familiar with the regulations, both the FEC and the IRS, and if you're at the state level, your state board of elections regulations, which are obscure and Byzantine, and purposely so, The way that it is set up is that, you look at these regulations, and you and then, in my case, my treasurer and my custodian of records, we would look at the same paragraph. What does this mean? What does this say? What do we have to do? And the three of us would each have three different opinions on it, because it's written so in such a manner that the reason for that is to keep outsiders out. That if you don't have lawyers and accountants and consultants that are familiar with FEC rules, IRS rules, State Board of Election rules, it's going to be very difficult. And what I've found and what I've learned over this last year is, as I've spoken to independent candidates across the country, across the spectrum, many of them don't raise money, at least not to the point where they have to start reporting to either the state or the federal level, because of this. Because the rules are so vague, so obscure, so it's so difficult to understand what you have to do and what the requirements are, that people stay away from that. And of course, that limits anyone's ability to run an effective campaign. So we'll see what happens with this. And again, I appreciate you putting that up there. But, I think the larger message of this is that to run an independent campaign, regardless of if you want to be effective, you have to have the people who understand, at the very least, the federal and state regulations. You're not, and that's just the back end admin of this. You're not talking about people who understand fundraising, who understand media, right? Who understand politicking and canvassing and all those kinds of things.
All right, good. We got to get moving here because I got to get some things covered. I haven't done a podcast in over a week. I usually do more podcasts than I have been, but there's a couple of things that have come up that really haven't seen the light of day that like they deserve to have. And we're going to move here from, North Carolina state politics into the world arena that Matt is very well versed in, that he understands very well, particularly when it comes to climate, war, and healthcare, the big three on the PBG. Let me bring this up. This I posted on my Twitter feed. Let's see. This was on November 15th. It's when this news first broke about on the Associated Press, this report that missiles from Russia had struck Poland, which has since been retracted. The reporter responsible for the article has been fired. None of the editors have, none of the seniors have, but this reporter on the ground has been fired. And I stated that I just saw the ghost of Archduke Ferdinand because, there were people that were citing NATO Article 5. The war drums were really ramping up and beating. They went into emergency session in Poland because of this thing. And Matt, you and I talk about the dangers of propaganda. This is a perfect example of what's going on. Taking these talking points, these stenographers are taking this information from the intel that's dirty, rotten, and wrong. And this shit could get us all killed. This was really a major thing. And it's kind of been swept under the rug. You're probably not going to hear very much about it anymore. But it's this intersection of intelligence agencies, military-industrial complex, the stenographers, and the journalism community. That is a big story and deserves more coverage and more light of day.
Right. And, there's an adage, as you know, you were a crime reporter, right? There's an adage that first reports are always wrong.
Yeah.
And certainly in war, that is especially the case. And the fog and friction of war, as it's called. But then as you lay out, George, the propaganda of this, the utilization of information by various sides in this war to promote their own interests by using compliant media to do so. And I think this war, and I've been observing war now for 20 years professionally, and then of course historical studies and everything else. But I think, as many other commentators have said, this is the most propagandized war that we have seen, at least in the modern era, in the sense of how effective the narrative control is by the various sides in the conflict. And in this case, yes, this could have gotten very dangerous very quickly. Unfortunately, 2 people were killed. But what if it was a hospital or a school or a retirement home, and scores of people were killed by this errant missile? First of all, with the media that all these decades after we've been involved in war, that they would rush out a story like this really shows, one, a desire for clicks, right? A desire for ratings, but also two, a desire to be compliant, to be in line with the intelligence agencies. I mean, there were a number of news organizations that reported intelligence officials saying this was a Russian missile. So they want to be the first out with that, of course, for the ratings, the clicks, for the headlines, everything else. But they also want to please these intelligence officials by publicizing this. These intelligence officials don't give this information out and then expect it to be sat upon. They want to see it utilized right away. And if you're a good reporter in their estimation, you will put it out right away. And we've seen this, throughout the last decades. I mean, the CIA has bragged about this for generations now, how they control American media. And certainly I think this was a case in point. And thankfully, and I'll give President Biden credit for it, because he quickly put this down in the sense of, now it wasn't a Russian missile, we believe it's a Ukrainian missile. I'll give him credit for de-escalating it, because this could have gotten very dangerous very quickly.
Well, and that NATO Article 5 that we talked about is how it may have become critical even without the U.S. being that involved in it, because the Article 5, as I understand it, basically is an attack on one of us, is an attack on all of us, and they respond accordingly. And, I got an email from Dr. Stephen W. Schmidt, who's on my podcast all the time, and he was talking about this Article 5, and I said, well, remember the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Remember the Russian bounties in Afghanistan. Remember the Viagra pills and the rapes in Libya. And remember the Maine. I mean, Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, all of these false reports and how this can get us into war. That Archduke Ferdinand, I mean, his assassination is kind of cited as one of the reasons, although I don't know if that's true, of getting us into World War I, for God's sake. And that was a death of one dude. I'm going to bring this up on I'm going to bring this up on screen here, see if I can get this to come up, because this is the great Caitlin Johnstone that I followed. I know Matt really likes her as well. This is what she had to say about it. She says, AP editor said she can't imagine a U.S. intelligence official being wrong. And man, this gets right to it. This is what we're talking about. The Associated Press reporter fired over an erroneous story on Russian attack. James Laporta shared the U.S. official's tip in an electronic message around 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. So it wasn't in the middle of the night here. We're talking middle of the afternoon. An editor immediately asked if AP should issue an alert on his tip, or, get this, quote, or would we need confirmation from another source and or Poland. Now, remember, I mean, the good doctor, Stephen Schmidt, immediately thought of this Article 5 from NATO when this first report came out. You would think that somebody on the AP desk would be thinking that way as well. But after further discussion, a second editor said she would vote for publishing an alert, adding, quote, I can't imagine a U.S. intelligence official would be wrong on this. Now, background that with what I just talked about. All of these false reports from intelligence, most notably the Iraq thing. I mean, that's the biggest in our lifetime, the biggest that there ever will be, hopefully. 1 million dead civilians, men, women, children, and little bitty babies in the ground because of bad intel. And this damned editor at the Associated Press is saying, I can't imagine an intelligence official being wrong on this. Okay, so here's what Caitlin says. Can you imagine not being able to imagine a U.S. intelligence official being wrong? This would be an unacceptable position for any educated adult to hold, much less a journalist. Matt was talking about first reports are always wrong. My God, in my class at Drake University 50 years ago, I mean, the one sign that was up on the wall for us to look at every day was never assume anything. Still less an editor, and still less an editor of one of the most influential news agencies on earth. And that's really important. We're talking about the Associated Press here. We're not talking about the North Warren County News, folks. We're talking about the Associated Press. These are the people who publish the news reports we read to find out what's happening in the world. And when she says we're talking about your elected representatives, from the president to the senators right on down the line. This is the baby-brained level of thinking these people are serving the public interest with. So I don't know, Matt. I keep going back to this all the time. I'll bring this up on
Right.
screen. You and I talk about this. I mean,
Yep.
this is the great movie Casino. It's got that scene in it that you and I talk about all the time where Robert De Niro confronts there's a little bit of a screenshot there, his casino manager, and says, are you too dumb or are you in on it? Either way, you can't work here. I look at that reporting in the context and the gravity of the situation and think, man, some tables ought to be turned upside down with this thing, but it's just going to slip into the dustbin of history, I think.
Yeah, it'll just end up being a footnote.
Footnote, yeah.
So and I'd be interested to have hear you talk with our friend Ariana Bakari
Yes.
about this.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I look at is it's the AP. Like you said, this wasn't,
Yeah.
but I mean, the pressure that these media organizations are under now, we've known their financial stress for decades now. At this point, it's been decades that they've not been doing well financially because the internet turned everything upside down. And with this thing here, like you want your, my phone flashes an alert. You want it to be AP. You don't want it to be New York Times. You don't want it to be Washington Post. You don't want it to be CNN. I mean? So there is that pressure they're under to be first in a way that, didn't exist 20 years ago. But then also too, this complicity, this, go along, get along, the access journalism, where they want to have this relationship with the intelligence community, with the Pentagon, with whoever, the White House. They want to make sure they're in the briefing room. They want to make sure they're getting the tips. Oh my God, if they got a leak or maybe even something classified, what a story that would be. I mean, all those kinds of things. So you're not going to get that if you're not going along with them, right? So the whole go along and get along. And I mean, the danger, yeah, of course, is it's. I mean, we shouldn't paint the media, of course, as something that has had a journalistic ethos that has never been tainted. I mean, certainly you brought up Remember the Maine, right? In the Spanish-American War, which was a media production, right? The Hearst Enterprises, they were fully invested in that war and they got the American public. And the same thing too, the media during World War I was absolutely horrendous. I mean? So, and I can't imagine that the media during World War II was multi-sided, right? I mean, so, but the willingness to do this when there is such a clear, there has been such clear evidence of U.S. government, U.S. intelligence, U.S. military malfeasance and manipulation of the media over decades. Yeah, I mean, I think Caitlin Johnston nails it.
Oh man, she's great. Encourage people to follow her. All right, I got to keep moving here. There's more on that I wanted to cover, but I just didn't have time. I want to keep going here with the Associated Press. I want to tell people, show again what I'm talking about. And I'm not a very interesting individual. Matthew Ho, real interesting individual. I mean, what he's been. But here's what's interesting about me. I was in, I went through journalism school in the 70s. I was working in the 80s. I quit to make a living in corporate America, kept my head down, kept my mouth shut because the people that owned the companies that I worked for were hardcore Republicans, folks. Okay, so I retired finally here 5 or 6 years ago and poked my head back up and look around, and I'm looking at media and thinking in my own experience, the difference between now and then. And this example is really striking. This is out of the Associated Press. This is just today or maybe yesterday. Hardship and hope. Winter missile storms show Kiev's mettle. Okay, what? Kiev, Ukraine, Associated Press. The play finishes. The actors take their bows. Then they let loose with wartime patriotic zeal. Glory to Ukraine, they shout. Glory to the heroes. The audience yells back, leaping to its feet. I'm reading this. What in the hell? You got reporters over there, and this is what you're covering. The actors aren't done. More yells follow, X-rated ones, cursing all things Russian and vowing that Ukraine will survive. More cheers, more applause. Here's the closer, folks. Bundled up against the cold, everyone then troops out of the dark, unheated theater, barely lit with emergency generators. They head back to the hard realities of Ukraine's capital, A more once comfortably livable city of 3 million now beginning a winter knowing increasingly shorn of power and sometimes water too by Russian bombardments. That part's true. But hope, resilience, and defiance. Really? Kiev has all those in abundance, and perhaps more so now than at any time since Russia invaded Ukraine 9 months ago. And this is the closer. When Butch, her French bulldog, needs a walk and the electricity is out in the elevator of her Kiev high rise, Lisa, whatever, and their dog take the stairs, all 17 flights down and up. The maternity clinic executive tells herself the slog is for an essential cause victory. So she's going up 17 or down 17 flights of stairs with her puppy dog. And here's another AP article, folks. 100,000 Russian troops killed or injured in Ukraine. The U.S. says this is from this guy that Matt can talk all day about. This is General Milley. And what he's talking about, and I'm not going to read all through this because I've been talking too much, but I'm going to read this highlighted portion here. Milley says as many as 40,000 Ukrainian civilians and well over 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the war. Now in its 9th month. Same thing probably on the Ukrainian side, Milley said. Holy buckets. And here's this article that we're all reading that's in the national newspapers today about a woman having to walk and endure 17 flights of stairs because the elevator's out with her puppy dog, Matt.
Yeah, no, the scale and scope of the war is quite horrendous, and the suffering is immense. You know, that article reads like a press release, or again, we keep coming back to this phrase, propaganda.
Yes.
And that's what that is. I mean, certainly there should be reporting about what life is like for the Ukrainians, but I think to put it in that context where it's such a clear, not neutral form of journalism is is a disservice.
Well, how about some context? I mean, how about the dead people? How about the wounded people? How about the dead kids, for God's sake? I mean, you want to talk about hardship? Being dead's a hardship, folks.
I mean it makes it sound like the hardship that the Ukrainians are going through is they're still going to the theater, and what they've got to do is they got to bundle up and they got to deal without electricity. But if they just persevere, they're going to win. And it's just that's the type of reporting that allows people to say, okay, this is worth supporting. This is worth seeing through the end to, as it says, victory. You know, whatever victory is, you know, you're going to remove the Russian army from Eastern Ukraine. I mean, from the Donbass. I mean, good luck with that, right? I mean, but that type of understanding of the war drives this support for endless war. And it's not like at a base public level. This is the type of understanding of the war that many members of Congress, or most members of Congress, have, and I think many members of the executive branch have. And unfortunately, I think there's as well too in the media, the punditry, the think tanks, etc. That's their understanding. And the actual suffering, the harm caused by the war is really out of touch to a lot of people. And that's the same too. I mean, as I, saw that about the winter is coming and winter is there already. It's almost December, right? The same goes for the Afghans again, as the Afghans go back into a second winter under Taliban rule with those sanctions and a broken banking system. And but you're not hearing much about that this year as we did last year, because the Ukraine war dominates the coverage. But I mean, I think what this keeps coming back to is the need to end this war. I mean, if you look at the photos that are coming out of the battlefront, it looks like World War I, going back to your pal Archduke Ferdinand. Yeah. I mean, in the sense that of the trenches that these soldiers are living and fighting and dying in, and the idea that somehow this war is going to produce something that is seizable, that is realized, that is something that can be realized, that can be the outcome can be controlled and dictated by, say, the American government or the London government or the Moscow government or whoever, is just ludicrous. I go back to the guy named C. Wright Mills, who was a political philosopher in the 50s, who was among the first to denounce the Cold War. And what he called those who promoted the Cold War on both sides, he called them crackpot realists. And that's what they are. You have this phenomena in Washington and in London, and the same exists in Moscow, of these crackpot realists, these people who believe that in spite of all the history of warfare, in spite of all the history of humankind, of everything we know about these things, that somehow our generation is different and we can control the outcome. I mean, certainly if you go back to World War I, say, every government, Berlin, London, Paris, Moscow, whoever, Vienna, they would all say that they were going to control the outcome, that, they
DC.
had DC, right? I mean, all those things, right? I mean, so all those, I mean, it's no different. And I mean, and that's why the fact that there has not been an effort to end this war in a timely manner, but rather an effort to sustain and promote the war, to keep it going. This is catastrophic, and the suffering, again, is just, we here in the United States, of course, have no conception of it.
Yes,
but the
we don't get
suffering
it
is
though.
immense, and I think there's greater suffering in Kyiv than just the you're going to see the opera in a cold theater.
Well, and here's the point, and I kind of glossed over this. I want to bring this back up on screen again. This guy, just in the past week or two, you talk about this call for negotiations for some type of a settlement. Milley appears to be making one. I know my eyebrows went up when I saw that. This is a guy that, was he chief of staff, but he's not supposed to be out in front in the media making calls for peace negotiations. But this guy, that's what he did. And to me, again, this is an underreported story. This was really significant. What did you think when you saw that?
Well, I appreciate him doing that. I'm glad he did. I'm glad someone's stepping forward and saying that we have a State Department and a Central Intelligence Agency that are more militarized than the Pentagon is at this point.
Yeah.
I mean that's not giving any credit to the Pentagon, but certainly, we have a diplomatic and intelligence corps that is incredibly dangerous, that they are shirking their responsibilities, what they're supposed to be doing, in favor of promoting militarism, in favor of promoting war. I mean, we have a Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who, rather than, these last 9 months pushing for an end to the war, finding a way to end the war, he has found a way to promote it. I mean, he's spent more time traveling around the world trying to find weapons for Ukraine than he has, networking, trying to get people together to bring an end to the war. And certainly we know about what has happened with both the American and the British governments in terms of curtailing peace negotiations that were occurring in March and April between Ukraine and since then, I mean, with the amount of money. And, as we're seeing, and as now is being more and more reported, you see the same phenomena occurring in Ukraine that, say, you saw in Afghanistan, where the Afghan government was told by American officials, don't worry, we're never going to leave. Trump's going to lose. Biden's going to remain in. Biden's going to come in, and we're going to stay here. We're sending you $300 million a day. That will keep you afloat, et cetera, et cetera. And then the greed, of course, comes into that. And the people who we had in power, and the same thing's occurring in Ukraine. You have people who are first of all, I think the Ukrainian government, under Volodymyr Zelensky, is under incredible pressure from its own right wing to win this war, victory at any cost. I mean, that was occurring as soon as he was elected. He was under that pressure. He's basically said they were going to hang him from a tree if he went forward with the Minsk Accords, right?
Yes.
Right? I mean, like that type of it. If people don't recall, when Zelensky was elected, he was campaigning on a platform to honor the Minsk Accords. Minsk Accords were came about in 2015 as a way to find an end to the conflict that was occurring in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass, and a bunch of different points to that. But it would have been a path forward to avoid what we're in now. And I think over that entire time, and now you've had American and British officials, particularly leaning into Ukrainian government ears, Ukrainian military ears, telling them that they will have unlimited support. All they have to do is keep fighting and they will win. And certainly, I mean, what you now see, of course, is where you are in this stalemate where, you know, you get reporting one week that one side is winning. The next week there's reporting the other side is winning. And I don't trust any of that reporting anyway, because none of these journalists are actually there. There's very few commentators who aren't on the take, who aren't in on it. You know, who aren't, I mean, particularly on the American media, so often these commentators are sit on the boards of directors or has some financial connection to the weapons industries, right? So it's in their best interest or in their financial interest or their responsibilities to promote a viewpoint that will help them sell Javelin missiles or F-35 airplanes or what have you. So the whole thing is rotten. The whole thing is crooked. This is a war that is about, when you bring it down to its base elements, this is a war. It's about fossil fuels and about megalomania, and millions of people are suffering, including hundreds of thousands of Russians' families that have had their children lost senselessly in this war. Their children are coming home maimed physically and psychologically, and others are living with the anxiety of not knowing what's happening to their children, their brother, their sisters, their parents, etc., who are fighting in this just completely senseless and unnecessary war.
Yes, and it is a criminal war of aggression by Russia and by Putin. I mean, we're happy to be the first one to say that. I don't overlook that. But, you know, here's my point on that. And to your point, you know, Zelensky was supposedly ready to get into some serious peace negotiations back in March or April or something like that. Boris Johnson comes sweeping in there, according to the reporting, representing the United States and NATO's point of view. And that all went by the wayside. We started pumping that money in there. And then who'd have thunk it? Everybody from Matt Ho on down was saying, if you send that money in there, if you send those bombs in there, that weaponry, it'll make it just more difficult, if virtually impossible, to get an early settlement like we might have had in March or April. Well, here we are coming up on December. And guess what? Zelensky, the guy that was ready to talk in March or April, now has a set of demands on Russia that are completely non-starters. I mean, no desire for negotiation whatsoever. And it's exactly because of what we said and what we talked about, sending these weapons in there. Again, it just, are they too dumb or are they in on it? Honest to God.
Yeah. And I think if you look at the way Russia launched the war with an incursion into the East, a limited incursion into the East, but then also that feint towards Kyiv. The basically, if you kind of visualize it, almost they tried to put like their hand around Ukraine's throat and to push to get to force negotiations. That's how I interpret their initial aspects of this war, was that they did not want to have a prolonged war. They wanted to do a rush towards the capital. No intention of taking the capital, because I don't think they could have, but the idea of threatening it, forcing negotiations. And of course, that seemed to be successful to a point. And then, as we know, through American official reporting, that these talks went on in March and April. There was promise. There was supposedly a 15-point plan was being hashed out. And then that was scuttled by Boris Johnson showing up. And Boris Johnson, of course, going with the certainly the best interests of Joe Biden and Tony Blinken, as well. So yeah, I mean, this is really, and now you're at this point where the American strategy seems to be that it's going to destabilize Russia and it's going to cause the Putin government to collapse. There's so many things wrong about that. There's so many things that are dangerous about that. There are so many things that are not thought out about that. One, the idea, if that does work, who replaces Putin? The likelihood of getting someone that's favorable to the West, it's not going to be some kind of fascist. It's not going to be some kind of right-wing nationalist. Those are the people that Putin is concerned about. Those are the people that are pushing Putin right now, his own right-wing nationalists. He's trying to keep those people in check. They're the ones most likely to take over if he was to collapse, which I don't think he's going to collapse. I think it's more likely that you'd see the Zelensky government collapse. And then who replaces Zelensky? Right. I
Well,
mean, again, the same thing too. And who is in best position to replace Zelensky? A right-wing nationalist government. These neo-Nazis we
the
hear about all the
Azovs,
time.
yeah.
I mean, so where is the thinking? Where is the process behind the American strategy and all this? But this is part and parcel. This is exactly what it's looked like for how many decades, with whether it was the American war in Vietnam, with the Central American wars, with the war in Afghanistan, with the war in Iraq, with the war in Libya, with the war in Syria. No thought process. No, if we do A and then B happens, what does C look like? There's none of that, because it's all American military and foreign policy is all based upon domestic political policy, and with politicians who have to look tough. They want to please the weapons manufacturers, and they're so scared to death that they're going to be accused of not being patriotic enough. I was just reminded the other day on a podcast that in George Washington's farewell address, he talked about pretended patriotism. The danger of pretended patriotism. It's something that's not spoken about enough. This idea that we have men and women who live lives that are the illusion of danger, and that they see as a political tool for them. But the reality is that they have no idea what they're doing, and their recklessness it's going to get us all killed. It really could.
Yeah, I guess. All right. I got to keep moving here because we got less than 10 minutes. I wanted to bring this up. I mentioned these two things that I thought were completely underreported. I've mentioned this on my podcast before. This was when Matt was in the throes of his campaign. I saw Dennis Kucinich interview just recently. Aaron Mate interviewed him, and you think, George Dennis Kucinich. Well, this guy Kucinich, if people remember, was leading the peace movement, the anti-war movement, when it came to Iraq, and the dude was right. So I have a tendency to pay attention to people that were correct. And Dennis Kucinich was correct, and he was commenting on this progressive letter. And Matt, I know that you're well aware of this, and I think this is really important. The caucus got 30 of its members to write this letter, send it over to Biden, didn't threaten him, didn't threaten to withhold funding or really do anything, just kind of suggested or encouraged that he might want to try some diplomacy, and it was immediately taken away. And then even on my show, Matt, I was on here raising hell with the weak-kneed political caucus and these 30 members and not having any guts or whatever. And Kucinich basically said, forget all that. The real relevance, the real importance about that letter being offered up and withdrawn the way that it was, is that it really is an opportunity for us to sit here and think, who are we as a country? Where an offer for diplomacy like that, just an encouragement, can be rejected like that. We need to think about this, because even from the time that he was in Congress to where we're at now, we appear to be bloodthirsty warmongers that won't even send a letter to the White House. And he said that's the real issue here.
Right. And we just, we're coming through we just came through the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis last month. It's something that wasn't spoken about, but it did get some people did bring it up in relation to what just happened in Ukraine, because we are on such a nice edge at time. But who are we? And one of the things I want people to also to realize about the money involved in all this, when you hear about the $40 billion being sent to Ukraine and everything else, that's just a part of the money involved in all this. I mean, the amount of weapon sales that have gone now to European countries that have been that this war has enabled, right? The purchasing of F-35s by multiple nations this past year in Europe because of Russian aggression, because of the Russian invasion, because of the Russian occupation, that has allowed for European nations to make these massive weapons purchases that they had put off before, had hedged on before. So, I mean, the scale and scope of the money involved in this is just massive. And then, of course, you look at the fossil fuels involved in this, and just as I think was be predicted, if you go back and you look at the history of U.S. fossil fuel development over the last 20 years, whether it's the fracking, whether it's the expansion of liquid natural gas export facilities such as Cove Point in Virginia, meant to export gas to Europe, this kind of is foretold. And what occurs is that you've seen an increase in, natural gas exports to Europe by a factor of 50% or something like that. You know what I mean? So there are these two massive which, if you read various economists, a guy like Michael Hudson, they will say that there are three industries that dominate American politics and the American economy. It's the military-industrial complex, it's the oil and gas, the oil mining and gas industries, and it's finance, insurance, and real estate. And so you got the military-industrial complex, you've got the fossil fuel companies, and then what's over the top of all that? That's the finance people, because as we know, 95% of the S&P 500 is owned by just 5 financial institutions: Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, a couple others. They're the principal shareholders in 95% of the S&P 500. So, I mean, you see how this all ties together. And then you get back to what we were talking about early on in this conversation about the money in these campaign races, about how that is much more important than doing any type of media work. That is much more important than going out and answering journalist questions or doing a debate. Certainly much more important than putting yourself in front of potential voters and answering their questions and listening to them. So it keeps coming back to the money. And, of course, you don't want to excuse the megalomania, the crackpot realists who are viewing this as, a real life game of Risk, where they want to see the map, the board, if you will, be in the color of blue being the United States color, not in red or whatever color our enemy or adversary is. So, yeah, I think Kucinich's point is exactly right. Who are we? What does this say that we can't even have? Look, the money is going to flow to Ukraine. There's no doubt that that the weapons aren't going to be approved and go to Ukraine. There's no doubt of where the American government stands on this war, what it's doing, what it has done. There's no doubt that there are many in Washington, D.C. who are thrilled to death about this war. And this is a war that they have wanted for a very long time, and they've got it. Just as there are those in Moscow who've wanted this war for a long time, and just as there are those in Ukraine who've wanted this war for a long time. The thing is, how come there's nobody who's even offering just the opportunity to say negotiations, to say ceasefire, to say
you can do both at the same time? I mean,
you
honest to God, if you
both.
can't stop that weapon from going in there, well, okay, let's talk. Also, why not do that? And we are out of time. I got a couple of things, quick hitters here I want to get to before we run out. One of them is the poster that's behind you, and I know that you did a lot of this campaigning, is Julian Assange. When you were out, tell me about that experience. Are people aware of what the hell happened to that guy, and do people want to talk about it? What was your personal experience with Assange on the campaign trail?
Most people are not familiar with Julian Assange.
Yeah.
Most people are familiar with the idea that the government is monitoring us, that the government is tracking your cell phone, collecting your data, collecting your information. Most people are familiar with that Orwellian take. Do they have the details all correct? Is it, no, but I think, and so when you explain about Julian Assange, they get it. What I find, though, is that people who are familiar are also often misinformed. And this is because of an incredibly brilliant misinformation campaign done by the American and British governments and by the Swedish government and a number of others over the years to make sure that the narrative about Assange is wrong. When I talk to journalists about Assange, about Julian, oftentimes the journalist will quite honestly believe that this is a hacking case, will believe that this is about Julian Assange and others in WikiLeaks breaking into computers and stealing things, right? That this is not an issue of leaks from whistleblowers, leaks from truth tellers, leaks from sources. They are unfamiliar with the notion that Julian Assange is a journalist. He's a member of the Journalist Union in Australia. He's
highly awarded,
on and on, multiple journalist awards. There's no question that he is because the misinformation campaign has been done so brilliantly and so well. And then, of course, there's the other aspect about it, the danger that this case is to free press and free speech in the United States, throughout the world, really. Because again, Assange, many people don't even know that Julian Assange is not an American citizen, that he's an Australian citizen. And so all those kinds of things people just aren't familiar with, including many journalists. And I that is because, again, of a very well done misinformation campaign by the American and British governments and the Swedish government and some others.
Well, I've got this comment up on screen from
Oh,
Roger.
Roger.
I want to show this. We don't have time to get to it. I'm coming up on the top of the hour here. There is something that I wanted to, and we'll get back to this. This is something that Matt talks about all the time. Let me take that down off screen. One of the great things about the campaign was the people that you get to meet and greet and that type of thing. Well, Matt Ho got to talk to Roger Waters. My God, he was on his Zoom supporting his campaign. I want to play this clip because if I don't play it, and I went in to get this, nobody else will, but I love this, and it mentions me, folks, so I got to play this. Watch this.
The way it opens, where you have this video of people who are uh, 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 annihilated, obliterated, just by a nuclear, and we're living that right now. I mean, we have a Secretary of State, right? My friend George, who's on this thing with tonight, was just talking with Chris Hedges about, this idea that we've got a Secretary of State who's running around purchasing weapons to give to Ukraine rather than negotiate peace, while we have that nuclear holocaust hanging over our heads. So yeah, I mean, but getting back to that, because I really want to explore this idea of your relationship with people as you discuss these things, which is very uncomfortable for many Americans. I think your interview with Michael Smerconish on CNN really showed that, how uncomfortable it is when you put forward these truths.
Well, I mean, the thing with Michael only became uncomfortable really because he hasn't the faintest idea what he's talking about, and he wants to pretend that he has, but he hasn't done any of the research. All Michael Smerconish has done is to learn the Western propaganda view of whatever it is that might be happening anywhere in the world. He's okay on Israel Palestine. It may be that he's slightly more balanced, but
But it was a high moment for me because Roger Waters. It was a little before your time, Matt. But in 1973, when Dark Side of the Moon came out, there was never anything like that. There's never been anything like it since. It ought to be on the Voyager out there in space for aliens to encounter because nobody's been able to do that type of thing again, including Pink Floyd and his music. What he's doing with his tour right now. This is not a drill and supporting the Assange cause and the anti-war movement and that type of thing. It's just stellar. And the fact that he came on and was a part of your campaign and mentioned me, my God, that was really a highlight for me. And I'm going to turn the volume up on that thing and repurpose that, and we'll get that on a little bit better the next time around. But good on you. Good on Roger Waters. I just wanted to play that here as we run out of time.
Oh yeah, and it's fantastic to get to know him and to become a friend of his, I think, at this point. And but his courage, um, his courage in doing what he's doing, speaking out, and he's been doing this for years. I mean, this is not.
Yes.
Right? I mean, he's been political for a very long time, and but his courage and continuing to do so. He doesn't need to do it. I mean, he's done that already. He doesn't need to be so vociferous. He doesn't need to take on the media. He doesn't need to take on the anger of so many. But he chooses to do so, and he is an incredibly gentle soul, I believe, who I think he's got a gratefulness for his place in the world and wants to utilize that to make things better, because he does realize the soapbox he has. He does realize the microphone he has. And I hope he's an inspiration to others who have platforms like he does. I would love to see more musicians, more artists, more celebrities doing as he does. Kanye West maybe being the exception, but yeah. Right. But, I mean, like the importance of, when you go to the show and, at some point, I think, I don't know if he's touring again here in the US, but he'll be over in Europe. And actually many of the, they're trying not to let him play at various venues in Europe and Germany,
Spain,
and Poland.
I think, Germany.
Yeah. I mean, the powers to be are very upset with him. And, but I would encourage people that when this concert is available on video to watch it, because it really is a phenomenal show in the sense of the integration of the music, the visuals, and the graphics, and the politics. All of it put together is really. I've seen very few things like it, and but what he's doing is really a benefit to all of us, because what he's saying is so important.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's off the charts. I always tell people about music. If you've got great musicianship, you got something. If you got music that makes you want to get up and move around a little bit, you got something. If you've got a song or you've got music that says something,
Right.
wow, combine all of those things. And that's what Roger Waters does with Dark Side of the Moon. I could talk about it and the other Pink Floyd albums as well, but and currently what he's doing too. But that Dark Side of the Moon thing, you mentioned Kanye. Well, his music, you could find any number of people that have music similar to that. Find something that's similar to what Roger Waters does. There's really nothing like it out there.
Yeah.
Well, we're over time, Matt. I want to wrap it up here, but I want to give you, as always, the last word. Give us a quick one here. Anything you want to wrap with?
No, thanks, George. Is one of the things I took from you. I've said a lot is that it's always perpetually the year 2020, right? We can either be dead from nuclear war in
Yes.
20 minutes or from climate change in 20 years, and that's not hyperbole. That's not an exaggeration. And the challenges that are facing us are existential. And that's not a I don't mean that to be not inspiring or to be not hopeful, but rather to do the opposite, to get people to have this idea that we are the only ones who can save us. No one is coming to rescue us, so to speak. And so that's more of a call to action than anything else.
Call to action and the question as posed by Dennis Kucinich, who are we?
Who are
I
we?
mean,
Exactly.
we've got to decide that, folks, and it ain't looking good right now, at least to me anyway. Matthew Ho, thanks again, pal, as always, for coming on a live line here on Podcast by George.
Thanks, George.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George, you like seeing Matthew Ho, and there he is, and you like seeing me, let me bring me back up on screen here and see if I can get that to work. All right. Come to podcastbygeorge.com. That's probably the best place to see all the platforms and choose whichever one you want to follow us on. Facebook and YouTube are at podcastbygeorge.com. Like us, share it. It's really important to make sure that this gets out so that Matt's wisdom gets seen and heard by other people. You can do that on both of those platforms. And then the audio only versions are on iTunes and Spotify, the iHeart Radio app, and Podbean. Even Amazon has us on places like that. You can get the audio platforms. You can just click and subscribe there as well. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up, folks. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.